Today's video is going to be about American news because I feel that this particular event and what really has been going on for the past, 90 days nearly, is so important that it's going to have knock-on effects in my country and possibly other European countries. I mean, already we've had riots here due to Black Lives Matter. Not only that, it's made me think, and I've got things I have to say about what's been going on and about the left and these criminals and why they're defended. Because this event has really made me think about things, and I need to get my opinions out there because I feel I have something to say, and not many people seem to be discussing these things. So I will be discussing the Jacob Blake shooting and Kyle Rittenhouse's situation, and then I will discuss why the left seem to be doing the kind of things that they are doing, and how we got to this situation where there's been rioting ongoing in America the past, 90 days now. So first, in regards to Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake. Jacob Blake is, for want of a better term, a deviant. But we didn't know that at the time, so I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. But essentially, this is what happened. He went to this woman's house, who I think he was in some way related to. I think it was like an ex-girlfriend of some kind. And he was threatening her and in a domestic situation, and the cops were called. There was a confrontation, they tried to get him to stand down, they tried to tase him, failed, which suggests he may have been on drugs, or maybe he's just a very strong guy, I don't know. He then went to the driver's side of the car and opened the door despite the cops saying, "Do not do so," and it was later revealed that there was a knife on the floorboards, wherein he was shot by the police and somehow, amazingly, survived. However, that was not the picture that we got immediately following the news breaking. What we got from the media was this: that Jacob Blake saw something going on, a fight occurring, and being the good Samaritan that he apparently was, he went out to break up the fight. But somehow the police got involved and they decided that he was the one who was committing crimes, fighting, and not the one trying to break things up, that they decided to shoot him when he went to go and get stuff from his car or to drive away. He didn't do nothing, he was a peaceful man, just trying to do his thing, his civic duty, to break things up. But of course that was anything but the truth, and not only that, we have since discovered that the man was a violent criminal. He actually had a warrant out for his arrest on 2 counts. I think it was domestic abuse. It was some kind of violent crime. Everybody knows this now. He may have been convicted for sexual crime, either against a child or an adult woman. I cannot remember, but I believe. So this is the kind of person we're dealing with here. A violent, sexual deviant. But of course, this is 2020. This is the politically charged, racially charged era that we live in. And when the media see reports of a black man getting shot by police, they immediately lick their lips and know this is going to make the headlines and thus will make them loads and loads of money, and also it might even help their friends in left-wing circles gain a bit more power and influence and help achieve their goals. So they manipulated the footage that they had of the shooting and made it out that he was just running to his car and then got shot as if unprovoked by the police, in order to incite a reaction. Was it to incite a riot? I am not sure, but they were certainly looking out for some kind of reaction, be it outrage or otherwise. But it was really the governor of Wisconsin denouncing the police and saying that they shouldn't have shot him, terrible, that really incited the riots, because rather than saying, let's just calm down, let's wait, let's just look into this and investigate and see what really happened, he jumped the gun and decided to use this for his own political agenda, resulting in riots in Kenosha. It seems strange already that Jacob Blake is forgotten, much like George Floyd was eventually forgotten because of the riots and because something else, the Rittenhouse shooting, overshadowed him. And we forgot that originally it was once again a black man being killed by the police, and once again it turned out he was a criminal. It's the same old, same old. But I'm going to get ahead of myself there and discuss the ins and outs of it. So let's get to the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting. So during the riots, a young 17-year-old, Kyle Rittenhouse, crossed state lines with a firearm to protect private property. Because Kenosha was currently under a fiery yet largely peaceful protest. People were so relaxed by this fiery yet peaceful protest that they asked people to come in to protect their property. Kyle was actually interviewed on the scene just before the violent confrontation took place. He was allegedly cleaning up. I think he even had to help somebody with first aid and standing guard on a garage or some kind of mechanic's place. It was a business. That was all he was doing. But then one thing led to another. I have still not seen exactly what led to the confrontation, but essentially a shot was fired by some unknown assailant. It may have been one of the men that he had shot in the arm, the one who survived, but I couldn't possibly verify that. And then he was being chased by a group of men. And then, obviously, we all saw the footage. Rittenhouse was beset upon by 3 or 4 individuals, one with a skateboard, and they were kicking the ever-loving crap out of him until eventually he managed to bring his gun to bear and shoot all 3 of them. One of whom was shot in the head, and then one was shot in the chest. Both of whom, of course, subsequently died. More on them later. One of them drew a pistol and attempted to shoot him, but obviously Kyle was quicker and shot him straight through the forearm, I believe it was. The confrontation was then over and Kyle called 911. He then later on gave himself up to the police. And he's since been charged, amongst other things, with first-degree murder. Now here's the debate about Kyle Rittenhouse, because it's pretty cut and dry that Jacob Blake, now that we know what happened, had intent to harm the officers and other people around him, and the police were called on him specifically for a reason. What about Kyle Rittenhouse? Was what he did self-defense? Was it something that can be described as reasonable force? Or was it murder? But first we must get one thing out of the way, his crossing of state lines, because that is a thing that has been talked about on and on by leftists online as evidence of his intent to kill people. Apparently he walked across state lines into Kenosha in order to kill protesters and black people because it was the Boogaloo and it was on. When in actuality, as we now know, he went there to protect private property. We don't know whether or not he was asked by these people or offered his services free of charge or maybe for a fee. We don't really know. That will all come out in the trial and when he gets interviewed and when the people who own the businesses he was protecting are interviewed as well. But what we do know, his intent was not to kill. In fact, he was pretty much peaceful for a large part before the fight kicked off. Now, what is clear is he probably did break the law when it comes to crossing state lines. As a minor and with a firearm, he probably should not have done that. And in fact, he did put himself in a position that he didn't need to be put into. But unfortunately, that wasn't necessarily his fault either, because if the governor and the powers that be actually did their job, this young kid would be at home doing what he likes to do and not have to take up arms to defend fellow citizens. He may have broken the law in regards to crossing state lines, but that can be dealt with. Whether or not he'll go to jail or to juvie hall for however many months for that, who cares? Yes, that's probably breaking the law, but I don't think it's breaking the law necessarily to own a firearm, just he should have been in his own state when he had it. As for self-defense, well, it's pretty clear that from the pictures that we have seen that yes, it was self-defense. Things were thrown at him, which I'd forgotten to mention. Some people say it was a Molotov cocktail, but we don't really know. There was no flames that burst from the thing upon impact. And in fact, during a large part of the fight, he didn't even pull the trigger. He was the one that was losing the fight because, well, it's one person against 3. He only shot them because, from what I could gather from the footage, from what I saw, he had no choice. Because one had a weapon, one had a skateboard, which, by the way, for those of you who have never owned a skateboard, they're very heavy, made out of wood, which can actually inflict brain damage if you hit hard enough with it. They were trying to beat him up, potentially trying to kill him. He didn't know if they just wanted to rough him up a bit or to kill him, so he did what anybody else would do in that situation who were armed. He shot them, and when one of them pulled the pistol on him, he shot him first. He was quick enough. That is self-defense, and he should walk away from that because it's very obvious that prosecutors have overcharged him, and it's very obvious from the footage that it's not murder. Now, who were the people that he shot? At the very least, the first 2, the ones who actually died. Their names were Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber. Anthony Huber being the skateboard guy. And unfortunately for the left, and unfortunately for the media, these men were anything but sweet, loving guys, both against violence and vandalism. This is Anthony Huber, the apparent hero of Kenosha who tried to attack an evil gunman, charged and found guilty of strangulation, domestic abuse, false imprisonment, and use of a dangerous weapon. So much for a guy who didn't like violence and vandalism. And what of the other man, Joseph Rosenbaum? He too was a criminal and a manlet. He was a convicted sex offender. His offence, sexual conduct with a minor. And in fact it was so severe that his registration was for life. He could never ever ever be removed from the sex registry. Not exactly the greatest bunch to be using as martyrs for your cause now, is it, leftists? But why is it that after all of this information was released to the public by people who were, I can only assume, were curious, these people can't just be loving, peaceful people who hated violence and vandalism if they were chasing and attacking a person who was there to guard private property? And not only that, they must have been particularly mentally challenged in order to attack somebody who was well armed. After all of that, they're still being defended. They're still being touted as these peaceful, loving people, and even GoFundMe was saying that these people were heroes and that Kyle is evil, and the media are, of course, attacking Kyle as a white supremacist, even though I've heard that he was actually Latino, and that he was gun nut and a boogalooist, and that he was out there to find violence and to kill people, even though before all of that happened, he was doing peaceful actions. Whereas those three men who decided to join a riot, despite the fact that they're meant to be peaceful people, loving people who didn't do nothing, that attacked him. But hey, whatever, apparently he's the violent one. Why do they defend these people despite all this information? Well, it's very simple, and it may sound a bit incredulous, it may sound a bit silly, but it's acceleration. That's what it's always been about. It's all about desensitizing people and convincing people that all these people who are criminals, all these black criminals or white criminals, it doesn't matter, these were all white men. I mean, apparently Kyle Rittenhouse is a white supremacist, but all the men he shot were white. It's acceleration, it's about desensitizing, it's about convincing people that all these criminals, all these men and women who are shot by the police can't possibly have done anything because the police are evil. It's about demonizing the police and controlling the narrative to make people think a certain way. And it's accelerationism because ultimately the hope is that trust for the police drops to an all-time low to the point where people demand that, well, they must go or they must be defunded. And that opens the door for these violent criminals and these violent leftist thugs to have free reign to do what they need to do for whatever reason. But the violent criminals, it offers a kind of, I would say, a smokescreen. While they're busy doing the things that they need to do, which is to rape, pillage and murder, the leftists will be going after important targets because they're the ones that have to fight and loot and attack for a reason. And it's not just for the wanton destruction, it's not just for the thrill of it. They want to attack the institutions. They want to attack certain people. That's why private business owners are amongst those that are being attacked, not just by looters, but by Antifa and other leftist groups. Why? Because they're against private property, so they are political targets. Why did they go after CNN, despite CNN bending over backwards for them? Why did they go after the White House? Why did they go after all these other well-known targets, including mayors who also bend over backwards for them? Because they're the enemy. Even the Democrats, at least the mainstream ones, ultimately must go because only the most rigorously communist can survive. It's purity spiraling as well when they go after their own. Ultimately, all of this chaos will destroy the structures of the white supremacist, patriarchal American system, because remember, these people don't think you can reform the system from within, although they have been doing a hell of a lot of subversion, because it's not just violent thugs. Whether or not they've decided that subversion is just not enough, it's failed, I mean, I think they've done a pretty good job, all things considered. Maybe it was the election of Trump, and they decided, well, Trump's been elected despite all our best efforts to get Hillary elected to continue the long-term subversion of America. It seems that enough is enough. It's been 4 years. People aren't hating him despite our relentless propaganda campaign. It looks like we're going to have to go to the most extreme plan that we've got left, and that is to just burn it all down and start all over again. Go full Pol Pot. The idea is to destroy all your culture, your institutions, the structures in place, and it doesn't matter if you're black, white, or whatever, you must all be destroyed and reconstituted as if like a phoenix from the ashes, as good communist citizens. They realise now that they can't get their leftist utopia through ideological subversion because it takes too long, and if Trump does what he claims he's going to do, or at the very least the Republican Party and people who are against them continually vote in right-wing candidates who are going to do something about this subversion, then the clock is ticking and they have to hurry to get this done, otherwise they're going to fail. They can't afford to go out there in the streets and do a full-on revolution like in Germany in the 1910s and 1920s. They don't have the numbers and they don't have the weapons because, well, the Republicans outnumber them and also have more guns. They have to systematically destroy the system in order to do it. But then again, it might not be that. It might be something else entirely. It might just be they're using this violence to make Trump look bad, which I think is probably most likely. Although I think a few of them would like this to continue so that America is so weakened internally that they can simply knock down the structures and replace it with what they want. I think the smart ones realise that really all they can hope for is that Trump looks bad. And to some idiots, he will look bad. But to most people he won't, because they will recognise constitutionally he can't do much. And not only that, it seems to be backfiring somewhat, because people, whether they buy the narrative of the police are evil and it's white supremacist and it's all racist and that's why these black men get shot and why those white men also got shot, they are at the very least worried about the violence. no matter who's doing it, whether it's a common looter or an Antifa activist. So they're buying weapons. They're kind of being radicalised themselves, but not into communists. If anything, they're being radicalised into being Second Amendment supporters, which is not good for them because they want to get rid of the Second Amendment so that that's one less barrier against them. It might not be complete accelerationism, destroy the structure of America and initiate the communist revolution. It could just be, we need to get Trump out. But there's one thing that people aren't talking about. I mean, they're kind of talking about certain things, but how did we get into the situation? Why is the black community rioting? Although it's not the whole black community, and I'll get into that. I don't mean to do a not all type thing, but I really will get into specifics. People are wondering why we've got to this point. How have we got to this point? And I have to wonder, have they been living under a rock for the past 5 years? Hell, if you look further back in history, for decades. Because it's very clear that this are the many end goals of the left, their attempts to use race to divide American and, to some extent, British society. Because let's be honest, despite all the stuff that's overshadowed this, ultimately this has come out of the African American community and all the historical baggage that goes along with it and recent history. It's not just a coincidence necessarily that it was George Floyd and Jacob Blake that was shot. The left, for the past 50 years, have been weaponising minority communities, specifically the black community, for their own political ends. And it's been working, mainly because the Republicans just gave up the black community, because not many people seem to realise or remember, or maybe they ignore this for some reason. How can you ignore this? African Americans used to vote Republican overwhelmingly in the 1860s to 70s, right up to the 1960s. That is 100 years of solid voting support from black Americans. Of course, we all know why they changed, because Democrats switched strategies and went for civil rights. First, slowly with Kennedy, and then later on with LBJ, with the Great Society, which introduced the welfare state and things like that, which I think was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was to give them the rights they were obviously owed, but also to control them, because this is still the Democrats we're talking about. Because what happened afterwards, despite all the voting, despite all the civil rights that were granted to them, ultimately, the community went backwards after all of the progress they made, despite the things against them. Because, as Thomas Sowell has rightly pointed out, because in those prior 100 years, black Americans were creating and developing the human capital that they needed to be successful. There was an increase in the amount of blacks going into the middle classes. Then that slowed down in the 1960s, 70s and 80s because of LBJ, and of course the Republicans being spineless. But as a result, this has chained the African American community to the Democratic Party, who are using them for their own ulterior motives. It's called the plantation for a reason. And they're being radicalised more and more as the decades go on, because it's needed for a divide and conquer purpose. That's really all it is. It's divide and conquer to obviously get what they want in terms of winning elections and ultimately political power. So after all of that spiel, how did we get to where we are, Mitch? Well, it's very simple. Ideological subversion, brainwashing, en masse, by the Democratic Party and allowed by the Republicans. Black America, although not everybody, obviously, have had this drilled into them for years and years and years, that the police are against them, the state is against them. Only this one political party, despite the fact it was the one party that was against them for the past 160 years, but never mind that, saved them, and it's the left that will save them because they're the ones that got them their rights in 1968. Never mind the fact that they've done far more damage to their communities. They've split apart families, with fathers being removed from homes and kids being brought up by gangs because of the legislation that the Democrats have enacted over the years. None of that matters. They will save you. They will give you your Gibbs. They will give you jobs. They will protect you from the evil racist white men. And it plays upon this collectivism that is apparent within the African American community, but of course it's not apparent in all individuals. But it does seem to be a thing that most afflicts that community, more so now than it did even back in the 60s and even before, because you've got to remember, most of these people are related to slaves, and when you're in a situation where you are an enslaved people, you can't really be a bunch of individuals if you're going to survive this ordeal and gain freedom. You're going to be collectivist in order to survive. It's only a natural reaction. Unfortunately, collectivism is also a bad habit. Now, obviously, in the 20s and in earlier decades, and to some extent in the 50s, black Americans were slowly getting out of it as they were beginning to adapt to rugged individualism and things like that, but that was quashed by the left in the 1960s. And they play on this collectivism because there are fears, whether it's legit or not, about white people and about the Republican Party, about slavery and things like that. It kind of creates a feedback loop. They see the press say, look at this bad thing happening to you, to these people like George Floyd, for instance, or
anybody else, Trayvon Martin, all the people that we've seen over the past couple of years, they're going to look back to that collective history and think, oh no, it's happening again, it's happening to us, this is what has always happened, even if in reality it's not what's happening at all and things have moved on. They are going to hunker down and believe everything that the left throws at them and tells them, because these are the people who gave them their civil rights, and these are the people telling them that things are wrong. Look, it's even being splashed upon the media and saying this is indeed what's happening to you, you are being oppressed. Even though you've got all these rights, they believe it because they're being told, and because they're collectivist, and most of them are unable to get out of that mindset. They're not thinking like individuals, being able to critically evaluate what's going on. Obviously, there are millions of them who can, and they're the ones who don't vote Democrat, and they're the ones who are Republicans or independent, the ones who try to break out of that cultural malaise and better themselves, and even to better the African American community. Because we have to remember, the people rioting aren't necessarily even working class blacks. They're very rarely middle class blacks, and for sure they are not upper class blacks who do exist. There are affluent African American communities and always have existed. These are the underclass, the lumpen proletariat, as Marx would call them, and these are the people who are going out rioting. These are the ones who probably make the bulk of the African American population, or at the very least the bulk of the poor of that particular population. It might be mostly working class, really. Now, even though the middle class and the working class might have people who are sympathetic to the leftist cause and things like that because maybe they themselves are brainwashed, it's the underclass in particular, because of their lack of education. I mean, a lot of people around the world aren't really educated on what's actually going on, but these people in particular are not. And when they're told and shown things in a particular way, like the media and the left like to do, of course they're going to think they're oppressed and that the whites hate them and they're the devil and they need to go out there and riot. They're being weaponized by the left. And it was this ideological subversion by the left, identity politics, that has created this, and it's been right in front of us for years. There's a reason why after Martin Luther King died, and to some extent even Malcolm X in his later years, that there was less of an emphasis on racism overall being combated in both America and the UK, but in particular on white racists against every other minority, because the far left had took over, allying themselves with people like the Nation of Islam, who had a vested interest and some similar goals, and decided this is the best way to get communism into the United States, and the Democrats also saw this as a good way to win votes. And unfortunately, this meant that they had to ideologically and mentally enslave African Americans and to demonise whites. It's not a coincidence for over the past 40 to 50 years we have had such things happen. Because if the opposite cause had happened and we just dealt with racism across the board, we wouldn't be having riots, we wouldn't be having these issues. And if we didn't have some of the state interventionist policies in the 60s, black Americans wouldn't be looting in the streets and destroying their own communities or other people's communities. I know I've been using the term black and African American in a general way as well to some extent. I do think that it's to our detriment that we do just blanket say whites, blacks, when really it's a lot more complicated than that, and we should be trying to recognise there are different groups, different factions, different types of people, and they're not all even African American in the traditional sense. There are people who are Haitians, Latino and things like that, and they have their own issues. We can't just say, oh, it's just the black community. It's more a specific part of the black community, really, and I think they're probably either the majority or at the very least a very large minority. Remember, all of this stuff that's happened over the past couple of months, maybe the last year, is because of things that have been going on in that community that the left has been taking advantage of, and they're using it to push their narrative. If we're going to combat it, if we're going to win over this, we're going to have to change black Americans' minds. We're going to have to go in there and actually help their communities too. The right can't just stand there and hope that they get votes, or just abandon them entirely. You're forgetting your own history, Republicans. You're forgetting who used to vote for you for 100 years. And we're already seeing a kind of shift with black males voting more and more for the Republicans. But of course, with women, it's different. 98% vote blue. It's going to require counter-revolutionary tactics. It's going to require counter-subversion in order to uproot what has happened. Because this is creating within our societies. It's dividing people when we don't need to be divided. We're all citizens of our respective countries, for God's sake. And ultimately, all these people who have lost jobs, they've lost livelihoods, they've lost businesses, homes, property, all of this is for what? It's really for nothing, ultimately, but to the left they think this is going to help bring about utopia where Orange Man is defeated. We may not have the institutional power, we may not even have the resources at the moment, at least some of us do anyway, in higher circles, but we should have, and I think some of us do have the willpower to go out there and enact change in these communities. I can't stand by and watch as minority communities are being brainwashed and used as human tools by ideologues to push their own politics. I think that is basically slavery. I think that's immoral and inhumane. And not only that, they're being told lies, they're being denied reality to their faces, and they're being turned into foot soldiers to attack another demographic. White people. But I don't know, I've been waffling on too long. I'm gonna have to edit this down a hell of a lot. So anyway guys, I'm gonna leave it there. Tell me what your thoughts. Am I right? Because nobody seems to be talking about that. The subversion that's happened in these communities across the Anglophone world. But I don't know. I'm going on too long. I'll see you later, guys.